Have you ever thought about the story of Samson? He was the strongest man ever, chosen by God to defeat enemies with only a donkey's jawbone. We learned it as a special story, one that shows divine help and faith. But what if there's something hidden beneath the surface? Something that changes everything once you see it? In the 17th century, a philosopher named Baruch Spinoza dared to question this story. He opened the book of Judges and found not just one, but 7 strange things that make you wonder if this tale is true at all. Are you ready to explore a new way to look at this story? One that reveals its contradictions and shows why it might not be about a hero, but about control. Let's uncover the truth behind the legend of Samson together. Before we continue, if a single idea in this video challenges you, share it with someone you trust, someone who values understanding more than certainty. And don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, and also leave a comment. Not with answers, but with what stays with you. As children, we are encouraged to admire him, to see him as proof that God intervenes in the world, and to accept his story as sacred history rather than legend. At first, the story is exciting. It is full of drama, danger, and impossible feats that feel larger than life. A man kills a lion with his bare hands. He defeats armies by himself. He tears apart city defenses as if they are toys. These moments are told with enthusiasm, often simplified and softened for young audiences, and always framed as evidence of faith. We are not asked to analyze them. We are asked to believe them. And belief, we are told, is a virtue. Yet even then, for many people, something feels slightly wrong. It is not always a clear thought or a spoken question, but a quiet discomfort that appears when the details become too extreme to ignore. How could one man do all of this? Why does God's power work in such strange ways? Why does the hero behave so recklessly, so violently, and often so foolishly? These thoughts are usually pushed aside because we are taught that questioning sacred stories is dangerous, that doubt is a sign of weakness, and that trusting without understanding is what faith requires. As we grow older, those questions do not disappear. They wait. They return when we hear the story again, this time with adult ears and adult experience. When we finally slow down and listen carefully, not as believers defending tradition, but as people trying to understand reality. The story of Samson begins to sound less like history and more like something else entirely. It begins to resemble myth, exaggeration, and propaganda rather than a record of actual events. This is where Baruch Spinoza enters the story. In 17th century Amsterdam, Spinoza was a young Jewish philosopher who did something that was considered deeply dangerous at the time. He treated the Bible the same way scholars treated any other ancient text. He asked who wrote it, when it was written, what historical context shaped it, and whether its claims matched what we know about the world. He did not approach Scripture with the goal of destroying belief, but with the goal of understanding truth through reason and evidence. When Spinoza reached the book of Judges and examined the story of Samson, he immediately noticed that it did not behave like a historical account. The details did not align with known reality. The narrative contradicted itself. The events violated basic logic, physics, and human behavior. To Spinoza, the conclusion was unavoidable. This story was not recorded in history. It was constructed, invented, shaped to serve a purpose rather than to preserve facts. For reaching this conclusion and publishing his reasoning, Spinoza was excommunicated at the age of 23. He was publicly cursed, cut off from his community, forbidden from speaking to anyone who knew him, and treated as if he no longer existed. His punishment was not for violence or immorality, but for asking questions and applying reason where blind obedience was expected. His fate serves as a warning that has echoed for centuries. Questioning sacred narratives threatens the authority of those who claim to interpret them. Before going any further, it is important to understand that examining this story honestly is not a comfortable experience. Once you begin to see the inconsistencies and impossibilities, it becomes very difficult to return to the innocent version of the story you were taught as a child. This is not the kind of discussion that fits easily into religious settings or family gatherings. because it challenges assumptions that many people have built their identities around. It asks you to look directly at ideas you were told never to question. The collapse of the Samson story does not happen slowly or gently. It happens suddenly, once you allow yourself to notice what is actually written instead of what you were told it means. The story rests on 7 major claims, each one presented as divine truth, yet each one falling apart when examined with basic logic and real-world knowledge. These claims have survived not because they are strong, but because questioning them has been discouraged through fear, guilt, and social pressure. To understand how fragile the story really is, it helps to begin with a small detail, one that seems harmless at first, but reveals a much larger problem. The story tells us that Samson once killed a lion with his bare hands and left its body by the roadside. Later, he returned and found that bees had made a hive inside the lion's corpse and produced honey there, which he then ate. This moment is often presented as symbolic or miraculous, an example of divine provision appearing in unexpected places. The problem is simple and devastating. Bees do not build hives in rotting animal corpses. They require clean, dry, protected spaces, and they are extremely sensitive to contamination. A decomposing body is full of bacteria, fluids, and decay, making it one of the worst environments imaginable for a hive. This is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is a basic fact of biology that has always been true. This detail alone reveals that the person who wrote the story did not understand how bees behave and assumed that no one would ever question it. For centuries, most people did not, either because they lacked the knowledge to recognize the problem or because they were afraid to challenge a sacred text. But the moment you notice it, the moment you allow yourself to say that this detail does not make sense, something important changes. You are no longer reading the story as unquestionable truth. You are reading it as a human creation. This is the method Spinoza used throughout his work. He took each claim and compared it to reality, not asking whether it was comforting or traditional, but whether it was possible. When the answer was no, he did not invent explanations or appeal to mystery. He accepted the simplest conclusion, which was that the story had been written by people who were shaped by their time, their culture, and their needs, not by direct divine revelation. When this method is applied to the entire Samson narrative, a clear pattern emerges. The story is not designed to teach moral wisdom or preserve historical memory. It is designed to shape behavior, reinforce obedience, and define enemies. Violence is justified by divine approval. Questioning is portrayed as weakness. Outsiders are presented as dangerous. Strength is tied to obedience rather than understanding. Samson, when viewed through this lens, stops being a hero and starts becoming something else entirely. He becomes a tool, a symbolic weapon created to inspire fear, loyalty, and submission rather than reflection or compassion. The story does not invite you to think deeply about justice or morality. It demands that you accept its message without resistance. If you have ever felt uneasy about this story, if you have ever sensed that something about it did not add up, that feeling was not a failure of faith. It was the beginning of awareness. It was your mind recognizing inconsistencies and refusing to fully surrender to a narrative that could not withstand examination. From here, we will move step by step through the 7 major claims that hold the Samson story together, starting with the angelic prophecy of his birth, and why it closely mirrors much older myths from surrounding cultures. Each step will reveal how carefully constructed this story really is, and how little it has to do with historical truth. Once you see it clearly, it becomes impossible to go back. The story of Samson does not begin with strength or violence, but with destiny. Before he is born, we are told that an angel appears to his mother and announces that her child will be special, set apart from the beginning, chosen by God to deliver Israel from its enemies. This kind of introduction immediately places Samson above ordinary people. He is not merely strong because he trains harder or fights better. He is strong because heaven itself has selected him. The story wants you to believe that everything which follows is justified because it was planned from the start. At first glance, this origin story feels meaningful and even beautiful. A child promised before birth suggests purpose, order, and divine care. But when the story is examined carefully, something familiar begins to emerge, especially to anyone who has read ancient myths outside the Bible. The structure of this story is not unique. It is part of a well-worn pattern that appears again and again across ancient cultures, long before the Book of Judges was ever written. In Mesopotamian legends, heroes are often announced by divine messengers before birth. In Greek mythology, figures like Perseus and Heracles are born after supernatural announcements and destined for greatness. In Egyptian stories, rulers and warriors are similarly foretold by gods to legitimize their power. These stories served a clear purpose. They made leaders and warriors appear chosen rather than accidental, favored rather than ordinary. They were not records of events. They were narrative tools. Spinoza recognized this immediately. He understood that when a story follows a formula used repeatedly across cultures, it loses its claim to uniqueness. It becomes evidence not of divine revelation but of literary borrowing. The angel who announces Samson's birth is not proof of holiness. It is a recycled device, one that ancient writers used because it worked emotionally and psychologically on audiences. The timing of when this story was written makes this even clearer. Most scholars agree that the Book of Judges was compiled centuries after the period it describes, during or after the Babylonian exile, when the Israelites were defeated, displaced, and struggling to preserve their identity. They were surrounded by powerful empires with impressive myths, heroic legends, and confident gods. In that environment, creating equally dramatic stories was not just comforting. It was necessary for survival. The angelic prophecy gives Samson legitimacy, but it also introduces rules, specifically the Nazirite vow. His mother is told not to drink wine or eat unclean food, and Samson himself is forbidden from cutting his hair. These instructions are framed as sacred, non-negotiable commands from God. They establish the idea that Samson's strength depends on obedience. If he follows the rules, he is powerful. If he breaks them, he becomes weak. This framework is critical because it shifts responsibility away from the story itself and onto the character. When things go wrong, the problem is not the system or the narrative. It is Samson's failure to obey. This is a powerful psychological structure because it trains listeners to blame themselves rather than question authority. If something does not make sense, the assumption becomes that the fault lies in human weakness, not in the story. However, the story immediately undermines its own setup. Almost as soon as Samson begins acting, he breaks nearly every rule associated with the vow that supposedly defines his destiny. He touches dead bodies, which would make him ritually unclean. He attends drinking feasts. He repeatedly involves himself with foreign women, despite being called to remain separate. Most importantly, he uses his strength for personal revenge and impulsive violence rather than for delivering Israel in any meaningful or organized way. This creates a serious problem. If the angelic prophecy was truly divine and the rules truly sacred, then Samson's repeated violations should have consequences much earlier in the story. Either the rules matter or they do not. The narrative cannot decide. Sometimes Samson is punished, other times he is not. Sometimes God supports him. Other times God seems absent. The logic shifts depending on what the story needs to achieve in that moment. To Spinoza, this inconsistency was not a mystery. It was evidence of multiple writers and editors shaping the story over time without concern for coherence. The narrative was not designed to be examined closely. It was designed to be heard, remembered, and emotionally absorbed. The contradictions only appear when the story is read carefully rather than reverently. This is an important realization because it changes how the entire story is understood. The angelic announcement does not establish the truth, it establishes authority. It tells the listener from the beginning that this character should not be questioned, even when his actions are cruel, irrational, or destructive. Once that authority is accepted, everything else becomes easier to swallow. What makes this especially troubling is how often this pattern appears across religious storytelling. Divine approval is declared first, and ethical evaluation is discouraged afterward. Violence becomes acceptable because it is framed as destiny. Cruelty becomes tolerable because it is described as part of a divine plan. The story no longer asks whether something is right. It tells you that it must be right because God chose the person doing it. This is why Spinoza believed that treating Scripture as untouchable was dangerous. It allows myths to function as moral shields, protecting harmful ideas from scrutiny. When divine authority is assumed rather than examined, reason becomes optional and obedience becomes the highest virtue. By the time Samson reaches adulthood, the story has already trained the listener to excuse his behavior. He is impulsive, violent, and reckless, but he is also chosen. The narrative constantly reminds you of that status, so that you overlook the growing evidence that something is deeply wrong. In the next part, this tension becomes impossible to ignore, because the story introduces its most famous and most absurd idea, the claim that Samson's supernatural strength is stored in his hair. This is where the myth fully reveals itself, not just as exaggeration, but as borrowed folklore that collapses under even the lightest examination. When we reach that moment, the story will no longer sound ancient or mysterious. It will sound familiar in an entirely different way, like a fairy tale that was never meant to be mistaken for history. At the center of the Samson story lies an idea so strange that it is often accepted only because it is familiar. The belief that Samson's strength resided in his uncut hair is not just unusual, it is logically fragile in a way that reveals the myth beneath the narrative. The story asks the listener to believe that an invisible divine force is stored inside a physical object, that power can be transferred or removed by a haircut, and that God's will can be reduced to the length of a man's hair. This is not theology in any serious sense. It is symbolism presented as literal truth. When ancient listeners first heard this story, the idea would not have sounded as strange as it does today. In the ancient world, hair was widely believed to hold a spiritual essence. Across cultures, warriors were forbidden from cutting their hair, priests let it grow as a sign of devotion, and enemies were humiliated by shaving them. Hair was not just decoration. It was thought to carry identity, strength, and sacred energy. The Samson story does not invent this idea. It borrows it directly from surrounding traditions. In Mesopotamian myths, heroes lose power when their sacred symbols are removed. In Greek stories, strength and protection are often tied to external objects such as armor, talismans, or blessings that can be revoked. In Egyptian belief systems, physical features were thought to house spiritual qualities. The idea that power could be cut away was not original. It was familiar, almost expected in ancient storytelling. This is where Spinoza's critique becomes especially sharp. If a story depends on ideas that are common to many cultures, then it cannot be treated as unique divine revelation. It must be read as literature shaped by its time. The Bible, in this case, is not revealing new truth. It is reusing old symbolism and presenting it as history. The story goes further and introduces Delilah, a woman whose role is as symbolic as it is problematic. She is not portrayed as a complex human being. She is a narrative device, a test, a trap. Her purpose is not to explore human relationships, but to explain failure. When Samson falls, the story does not blame his impulsiveness, his violence, or his lack of wisdom. It blames a woman. This pattern appears again and again in ancient texts, where female characters are used to personify temptation and downfall. Delilah repeatedly asks Samson to reveal the source of his strength. Each time he lies, and each time she persists. This repetition is important because it strips the scene of realism. No reasonable person would remain with someone who repeatedly betrays them to their enemies. The story requires Samson to behave irrationally so that the plot can move forward. His stupidity is not an accident. It is necessary for the myth to function. When Samson finally reveals the truth about his hair, the story reaches its symbolic climax. He falls asleep, his hair is cut, and his strength leaves him. The text says that the Lord departed from him, Yet there is no explanation of how or why this happens at that precise moment, rather than after any of his previous violations. The logic is thin because it is not meant to be examined, it is meant to be accepted. This raises a question that the story never answers. If Samson's strength came from God, then God could have removed it at any time. Why tie divine power to a haircut? Why make omnipotence dependent on scissors? The only answer that fits the evidence is that the story was not written to explain divine mechanics. It was written to teach obedience through symbolism. Hair becomes a visible rule. Obedience becomes measurable. You can see whether the command is followed. This makes the story easier to teach and easier to control. Abstract faith becomes physical compliance. This is not accidental. It is how myths become tools. Once Samson's hair is cut, he is captured, blinded, and imprisoned. The story presents this as a moral lesson, yet it avoids the deeper implications. Samson is punished not for violence, not for cruelty, not for misuse of power, but for breaking a ritual rule. Ethics are replaced by ritual obedience. The story sends a clear message. What matters most is not how you treat others, but whether you follow sacred instructions. This way of thinking has had lasting consequences. When belief systems prioritize ritual over reason and obedience over ethics, they create environments where harmful behavior can be excused as long as the correct symbols are maintained. Samson's story is not just ancient entertainment. It is a template for authority. The final irony of the hair myth is that Samson's strength returns as his hair grows back. This detail is often treated as hopeful, but it reveals the story's underlying contradiction. If breaking the vow caused God to leave, then regrowing hair should not reverse that. Repentance, change, or understanding should be required. Instead, time alone restores power. The story quietly abandons its own moral logic. Spinoza saw this as further proof that the text was not guided by divine consistency, but by narrative convenience. The rules bend when the story needs a dramatic ending. God's will becomes a storytelling device rather than a coherent principle. In the next part, the story reaches its violent conclusion, where Samson kills more people in his death than in his life, and this massacre is framed as heroic and redemptive. It is here that the cost of myth becomes impossible to ignore, because the story demands that destruction be celebrated as faithfulness. As the story approaches its end, it abandons any remaining subtlety and reveals its core message in the most dramatic way possible. Samson, now blind, imprisoned, and humiliated, is brought out for public display. The Philistines gather not merely to punish him, but to celebrate his defeat as proof of their God's superiority. This moment is important because it reframes the conflict entirely. What was once personal becomes symbolic. Human suffering is turned into spectacle, and violence becomes a form of worship. Samson is placed between the pillars of the temple, a position that is carefully chosen by the narrative. The architecture itself becomes part of the message. Pillars represent order, stability, and civilization. When Samson pushes them apart, he is not just destroying a building. He is collapsing a social structure. The story presents this destruction as righteous, even beautiful, because it aligns with the will of God as understood by the author. This is where the narrative demands the greatest suspension of moral judgment. Samson does not target soldiers alone. He does not seek justice or restraint. He brings the entire structure down, killing men, women, leaders, and spectators alike. The text offers no reflection on their individuality, no acknowledgement of innocent lives. They are reduced to numbers, and those numbers are used to praise Samson's final act. The story states that Samson killed more people in his death than in his life, and this is presented as triumph. There is no grief, no moral hesitation, no space for compassion. Death becomes proof of faithfulness. Destruction becomes redemption. This is not a side detail. It is the climax of the entire story. Ancient listeners would have understood this scene within the logic of tribal warfare. Survival depended on dominance, and gods were believed to favor the strongest side. But when this story is lifted out of its historical context and treated as timeless moral truth, the implications become dangerous. Violence is no longer an unfortunate necessity. It becomes sacred. Spinoza argued that this is where religious storytelling most clearly reveals its human origin. A truly divine moral system, he believed, would not need to glorify mass killing to make its point. It would teach understanding, justice, and ethical consistency. The Samson narrative does none of these. It rewards destruction because destruction serves the story's emotional power. What makes this moment even more troubling is that Samson does not express remorse or growth. His final prayer is not one of reflection or transformation. It is a request for strength one last time, motivated by revenge. The story does not challenge this motive. It endorses it. Personal anger is aligned with divine purpose without question. This blending of personal emotion and divine authority is one of the most influential and dangerous patterns in religious storytelling. When human rage is framed as God's will, accountability disappears. Any act, no matter how extreme, can be justified if it is believed to be divinely sanctioned. The Samson story quietly teaches this lesson without ever naming it. The narrative also reinforces a troubling idea about suffering. Samson's blindness and imprisonment are portrayed not as tragedies, but as necessary steps toward redemption. Pain becomes a tool. Loss becomes preparation. This framing encourages acceptance of suffering rather than understanding or prevention. It teaches endurance, not insight. When the temple falls and the story ends, there is no reflection on what has been achieved. No peace follows. No moral clarity emerges. The story simply stops, leaving destruction behind and calling it victory. This abrupt ending reveals something important. The story was not designed to resolve conflict. It was designed to assert dominance and reinforce loyalty. Over centuries, this pattern has repeated itself in countless interpretations. Violence is excused when performed by the faithful. Suffering is justified when it serves a perceived higher purpose. Questioning is discouraged because obedience is easier to manage. Stories like Samson's do not merely reflect belief systems. They help shape them. Spinoza believed that once people begin to see these stories as symbolic rather than literal, their power changes. They no longer command fear. They invite reflection. The temple does not need to fall for the lesson to be understood. The real collapse occurs when reason is replaced by blind acceptance. In the next and final part, we step back from the story entirely and examine why these narratives were preserved, how they were taught, and what happens when modern minds encounter ancient myths without the tools to interpret them critically. It is there that the deepest layer of meaning emerges, not in the miracle or the violence, but in the silence that follows. When the dust settles and the echoes of destruction fade, a quieter question remains, one that is rarely asked but deeply important. Why were stories like this preserved so carefully, copied for centuries, and elevated to sacred status? Why did communities choose to pass them on to their children, generation after generation, even when the moral tension within them was obvious? The answer is not found in miracles or divine commands, but in psychology, power, and the human need for meaning in a fragile world. Ancient societies did not preserve stories because they were gentle or morally perfect. They preserved stories because those stories worked. They shaped identity, reinforced boundaries, and explained suffering in ways that made chaos feel manageable. The Samson narrative, like many others, functioned as a myth of strength and survival in a time when survival itself was uncertain. It told people who they were, who their enemies were, and why hardship could be endured rather than questioned. In that sense, the story was not lying. It was performing a function. The problem emerged much later, when these stories were removed from their original context and treated as timeless moral instruction rather than historical myth. What once operated as tribal memory hardened into doctrine. Symbols became commands. Narrative became the rule. And once that transformation occurred, questioning the story no longer meant exploring meaning. It meant threatening authority. This shift explains why interpretations grew narrower over time instead of broader. Ambiguity is dangerous to institutions. Questions weaken control. Literalism simplifies belief and makes it enforceable. A story that once invited reflection became something that demanded obedience. In this new framework, Samson was no longer a tragic, violent figure shaped by his culture. He became a hero to be admired, not examined. Spinoza recognized this transformation as one of the great tragedies of religious history. He believed Scripture was never meant to replace reason, but to guide moral imagination. When stories are read without logic, they lose their educational power and become instruments of fear. Faith turns rigid. Curiosity becomes sin. The text stops speaking and begins commanding. This is why modern audiences often feel discomfort when they encounter these narratives honestly. The discomfort is not weakness, it is awareness. Something inside recognizes the mismatch between ancient tribal values and modern ethical intuition. Children feel this instinctively. They ask questions adults have learned to suppress. They notice cruelty where they are told to see holiness. They sense when a story is demanding acceptance instead of offering wisdom. Wisdom before religion restores something essential that rigid teaching is removed. It slows the mind. It removes pressure to agree or disagree. It allows images and ideas to pass gently through consciousness without forcing conclusions. In this state, the listener is free to notice patterns, emotions, and contradictions without fear. Meaning returns to the story not as command but as invitation. When viewed this way, Samson's strength becomes symbolic of uncontrolled power. His vow represents inherited identity rather than chosen virtue. His downfall reflects impulsiveness and unchecked desire. His final act reveals how easily suffering can be redirected into destruction when reflection is absent. These are not divine lessons. They are human ones. And this is the deeper truth hidden beneath the miracle language. The Bible does not preserve perfect heroes. It preserves human behavior in its rawest form, magnified through myth. The danger comes not from reading these stories, but from refusing to interpret them. Once the stories are allowed to breathe again, they lose their threat. They no longer demand belief in impossible acts. They ask for understanding of timeless patterns. Power without wisdom, faith without reflection, obedience without ethics. These patterns repeat across cultures, religions, and centuries because they are rooted in human nature, not divine command. The greatest irony is that questioning these stories does not destroy faith, it matures it. Faith that cannot survive honest inquiry was never strong to begin with. Ancient wisdom traditions understood this. They expected listeners to wrestle with stories, not swallow them whole. The wrestling was the point. As this journey ends, there is no final verdict to deliver, no belief to replace another. There is only an invitation to listen differently, to slow down, to allow ancient words to speak in their own voice, without fear, without urgency, without the demand to accept or reject. Meaning, when it arrives naturally, stays longer than any imposed conclusion. And perhaps that is why these stories still exist. Not because they are flawless, but because they reflect us. Our strength, our fear, our hunger for meaning, and our tendency to confuse power with truth. When we recognize ourselves in them, the stories stop controlling us and begin teaching us again, if you allow them to.